It was April of 2016, a crisp spring morning in the suburbs of southeastern Pennsylvania. The sun had just begun its climb, spreading a thin veil of light across quiet neighborhoods still stirring awake. At 7 a.m., 22-year-old Sarah Whitmore laced up her running shoes, pulled her long brown hair into a ponytail, and stepped out of her parents' home for what should have been nothing more than a simple jog. She was training for a charity 5K. The route was familiar, safe, and well-trodden. Ridgewood Trail, a winding stretch of pavement that cut through wooded patches and grassy fields before looping back toward her neighborhood. She had run it dozens of times before. But that morning would be different. That morning, Sarah Whitmore vanished. Her parents, Daniel and Margaret, remembered hearing the door close softly as she left. They thought nothing of it. Sarah was disciplined about her runs, even when the mornings were chilly. She kept her routine strict, almost ritualistic. She'd be gone 30 to 40 minutes, then back for breakfast before heading to her part-time job at a local daycare. But when 40 minutes passed, then an hour, and Sarah hadn't returned, unease began to grow. By 9 a.m., that unease had turned to panic. Daniel tried calling her cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Margaret began driving the streets, hoping to spot her daughter's familiar stride along the roadside. She didn't. At 10:15, they contacted police to report her missing. The initial response was urgent, but restrained. Officers from the township's police department checked the parking lot at Ridgewood Trail. Her car wasn't there. She hadn't needed to drive. The officers walked sections of the trail, calling her name, checking benches and peering into the trees. Nothing. By noon, Sarah's absence was classified as suspicious. Police extended the search perimeter. Within hours, a grid system was established. Volunteers, neighbors, and law enforcement canvassed the woods on either side of the trail. Search dogs were deployed, their handlers hoping to catch Sarah's scent from a jacket her parents provided. But the dogs circled aimlessly, confused, unable to lock onto a trail. It was as if she had never been there at all. The trail itself offered little comfort. Ridgewood stretched for nearly 3 miles, with side paths cutting into dense thickets. To one side, suburban homes sat quietly behind rows of trimmed hedges. On the other, acres of undeveloped land sloped into shadowy woods. For runners, it was a sanctuary, quiet, scenic, and mostly safe. For investigators, it was a nightmare. Dozens of possible exit points, blind corners, and places to vanish. By the end of that first day, over 50 people were actively searching. Neighbors recalled the image of Margaret Whitmore standing at the edge of the trail, clutching her daughter's sweatshirt, begging anyone passing by if they had seen her. Officers comforted her, as best they could, but the silence of the trail offered no reassurance. When the sun dipped below the trees, the search continued with flashlights and ATVs. Helicopters from state police circled overhead, their thermal cameras scanning the woods for heat signatures. Nothing appeared. Not a body, not a discarded shoe, not even a footprint. At 1:30 a.m., the official search was suspended until daylight. Sarah's parents, however, did not sleep. They sat awake, staring at the front door, waiting for it to open. It never did. The following morning, media trucks arrived. A local station aired her photo, a smiling young woman with soft features, a runner's frame, and bright eyes that betrayed no hint of the storm to come. Interviews with her friends painted the same portrait: a devoted daughter, a caring sister, and a loyal friend. She had no enemies, no troubled past. She wasn't involved in drugs, gambling, or crime. She didn't party heavily. There was no clear reason she would have wanted or needed to disappear. Detectives worked quickly to rule out possibilities. They traced her phone records. The last activity was at 7:06 a.m., a text to her roommate saying she'd be back in under an hour. After that, nothing. Her bank cards were unused. Social media went silent. There was no activity to suggest she had run away or staged her disappearance. For investigators, the clean break was alarming. In most missing persons cases, there were at least fragments, a trail of data, a purchase, a sighting. But with Sarah, the line went dead almost instantly. As hours turned into days, frustration set in. Volunteers scoured the woods, combing through thickets, ditches, and streams. Officers interviewed joggers, dog walkers, and homeowners along the trail. One woman reported hearing what she thought was a scream around 7:30 that morning, but she had brushed it off, assuming kids were playing nearby. Beyond that, no one saw or heard anything unusual. Every missing persons investigation has its critical first 48 hours. And with Sarah, those hours slipped away with nothing to show. The trail was as empty as when she first set out that morning. By the third day, her parents stood before news cameras, pleading for information. Their voices cracked as they begged anyone who might have seen something, anything, to come forward. Flyers were posted on every corner. A reward was announced. But the tips that trickled in led nowhere. What haunted investigators most was the absence of evidence. If she had been attacked, there should have been signs: a struggle, torn clothing, personal belongings left behind. If she had fallen, her body should have been found. But Ridgewood Trail gave nothing back. And as the days passed, the community began to realize something chilling. Sarah Whitmore had vanished in broad daylight on a familiar path in a suburban town where nothing like this had ever happened before. She had stepped out her front door for a morning, run, and simply ceased to exist. 9 years later, her name would still echo in that silence. But in 2016, all anyone could do was wonder, how does a young woman disappear without a trace in the span of a single morning? And who, or what, was waiting on Ridgewood Trail that day? The first 2 days of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance would become a blur of frantic movement, whispered speculation, and growing fear. In cases like this, investigators often say the clock is their greatest enemy. Every hour that passes without answers makes the chance of finding someone alive slip further away. And in Sarah's case, those first 48 hours were nothing short of chaos. By the morning after her disappearance, Ridgewood Trail looked less like a suburban jogging path and more like the staging ground of a large-scale rescue operation. Patrol cars lined the street, their lights washing red and blue against the trees. Search and rescue units marched in formation, dragging long sticks through undergrowth, marking grids with fluorescent tape. Helicopters from the state police hovered above, their blades chopping through the stillness of the town, thermal cameras sweeping the woods for any sign of human heat. On the ground, search dogs strained at their leashes, noses to the dirt, handlers urging them forward. But each attempt ended the same way. The dogs circled, wandered, and eventually sat down, confused. Sarah's trail, if it had ever been there, was gone. Neighbors arrived in droves, bringing bottled water and flashlights, volunteering to walk miles of wooded terrain. Teenagers skipped school to staple flyers on telephone poles. A local church opened its doors as a command center, serving coffee and sandwiches to exhausted volunteers. The community was united in purpose, but beneath the surface was a creeping realization. Despite the massive effort, there were no clues. Detectives moved quickly to establish a timeline. They reconstructed Sarah's last known movements, leaving her parents' home around 7 a.m., her phone sending its final text minutes later, and silence afterward. Investigators canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen a runner that morning. Most hadn't. A few recalled glimpses, a woman in athletic gear jogging past, earbuds in, ponytail swinging. But none could pinpoint exactly when or where, and none could say for certain if it had even been Sarah. One report stood out. A neighbor living half a mile from the trail told police she thought she'd heard a scream around 7:30 that morning. It was faint, distant, and lasted only a second. At the time, she assumed it was children playing in the woods. Now she wasn't so sure. The information was too vague to act on. No direction, no follow-up sound. Just a fleeting moment in the air. Investigators marked it in their notes, but without corroboration, it was little more than a haunting possibility. Back at the Whitmore home, detectives turned, their attention to the people closest to Sarah. Statistically, when someone goes missing, the first place police look is the inner circle: family, friends, and partners. Interviews began almost immediately. Daniel and Margaret were asked to recount every detail of Sarah's habits, her mood the night before, and any unusual behavior. They had nothing to give. She had been her normal self, preparing for her run, talking about her plans for the week. There were no fights, no tensions, no reasons she would leave willingly. Attention then shifted to Sarah's boyfriend, Jason Miller. He was 24, worked as a mechanic, and had been dating Sarah for nearly 2 years. When detectives arrived at his apartment, he was cooperative, but visibly nervous. He explained that he hadn't seen Sarah that morning. He had last spoken to her the previous night, a short call before bed. He insisted their relationship was strong, with no major conflicts, but the police knew better than to take words at face value. They scrutinized his alibi, interviewing co-workers who confirmed he had clocked in at 8 a.m., a time-stamped record backing it up. Still, detectives kept him on the list. In cases like this, boyfriends are rarely dismissed quickly. Meanwhile, investigators pulled traffic camera footage from intersections near Ridgewood Trail. Hours of grainy video were poured over frame by frame. One anomaly caught their attention, a white pickup truck circling the area around the time Sarah would have been running. The truck slowed near the trailhead, then drove off. Minutes later, it returned, looping past again before vanishing. Detectives flagged the vehicle, but identifying it would prove more difficult than expected. The footage was too blurred to read a license plate, and no one in the neighborhood recognized it. As night fell for the second time since Sarah vanished, frustration mounted. Detectives knew the odds were shifting against them. Missing adults, particularly young women who aren't found in the first 2 days, are rarely found unharmed. Media coverage intensified. Reporters crowded the Whitmore lawn, microphones ready, asking if there had been ransom notes, if Sarah had enemies, if her family suspected foul play. Margaret's tearful pleas were broadcast on every local station. Please, if someone has her, let her go. She just went out for a run. She just wanted to come home. The FBI was officially brought in on the second day. Their agents met with local law enforcement, offering resources and expertise. Analysts began combing through Sarah's digital footprint, emails, social media, phone logs, looking for hidden communications, unusual patterns, anything that might suggest she had been lured or targeted. But the accounts were clean. No threatening messages, no stalkers leaving digital trails. The silence was deafening. Despite the overwhelming response, hundreds of people searching, helicopters scanning, the FBI involved, the investigation remained stalled. Nobody, no weapon, no confirmed sightings. The case file was filled with notes, but no leads were actionable. For every question answered, 2 more arose. And as the 48-hour mark passed, investigators were forced to confront a grim reality. Sarah Whitmore was no longer just a jogger who had gone missing. She was now the center of a potential abduction case. Each passing moment lowered the chance of finding her alive. For the Whitmore family, the second night was worse than the first. They sat in their living room, lights dimmed, their daughter's photo staring back at them from every flyer. Outside, news vans kept their cameras trained on the house, waiting for developments that never came. Inside, Daniel whispered that it felt like Sarah had been swallowed by the earth itself. Margaret only nodded, silent tears slipping down her face. And yet, amid the chaos, one fact stood stark and unshakable. In broad daylight, along a well-used trail surrounded by homes and neighbors, a young woman had disappeared. 2 days had passed, and still no one could explain how. 3 weeks after Sarah Whitmore vanished, the tone of the investigation shifted. The urgency that had driven those first days began to slow, not because the case was solved, but because the hope of finding her alive was fading. The official language changed. What had been called a search was now referred to quietly as a recovery. Officers stopped talking about rescue operations and instead focused on the possibility of remains. Families in situations like this often cling to any word, any gesture from authorities. But for the Whitmores, the change in tone was crushing. Their daughter had gone for a run and disappeared, and now, 3 weeks later, Officials were preparing them for the likelihood that she was gone for good. The community felt the weight of it. Ridgewood, once a friendly suburban trail lined with joggers, cyclists, and families walking dogs, became a symbol of dread. Fewer people ventured there. Parents who once let children ride bikes along its loop now kept them indoors. The sound of laughter and casual conversation was replaced by silence, punctuated only by the occasional police patrol or volunteer still clinging to the hope of finding something that had been missed. A place meant for exercise and community had turned into a ghostly reminder of loss. With the trail mostly empty, attention shifted to speculation. Local forums and Facebook groups lit up with theories. Some users pointed to law enforcement, claiming investigators had mishandled critical evidence. They asked why the white pickup truck captured on traffic footage had never been tracked down, or why the neighbor's scream wasn't investigated more aggressively. Others spun darker theories, whispering that Sarah had been stalked for weeks before she vanished, that someone had studied her running habits, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Stories circulated of strange vehicles spotted near the trail on previous mornings, and of an unfamiliar man seen sitting in his car during early hours. None of these accounts were ever confirmed, but in the absence of facts, suspicion filled the void. For Sarah's family, each day without answers became its own torment. Her parents refused to touch her room. The bed remained neatly made, the dresser still holding folded clothes, and the shelves lined with photos and mementos from her childhood. Margaret would sit in the doorway for hours, staring at the room as though her daughter might return at any moment. Daniel busied himself with calls to detectives, pressing for updates, demanding to know why leads had dried up so quickly. Their grief took different shapes, but it was the same grief, raw, unresolved, and suffocating. The community tried to respond with gestures of solidarity. Candlelight vigils were held on the town green. Churches rang their bells in Sarah's name. Strangers tied yellow ribbons around trees near the trail. These gestures were meant to comfort, but they also underscored the painful reality. Sarah had become a symbol, her name spoken in the past tense by people who had never even met her. Local officials sought to preserve her memory in a lasting way. 3 weeks after her disappearance, Ridgewood Trail was officially renamed Whitmore Loop. A bronze plaque bearing her photo was installed at the trailhead, honoring her as a young woman whose life had been cut short. But for many, the gesture felt premature. The family hadn't been given closure, no body had been found, and no one had been held accountable. The renaming wasn't healing. It was a reminder that the case was already slipping into history, while the truth remained buried. Not everyone in town agreed on what had happened. Some believed Sarah was dead, and her body simply hadn't been found. Others argued she had been taken alive and might still be out there, waiting to be discovered. Still others entertained conspiracies, that Sarah had run away to start over, that she had a secret life no one knew about, that her disappearance was staged. Investigators pushed back against these rumors, but in a small town, speculation spread faster than facts. The case had no shortage of theories, but almost no evidence to support them. Detectives re-examined every lead: the boyfriend, the scream, the white pickup truck. Each was scrutinized, tested, and then quietly set aside. The FBI conducted multiple interviews, ran phone records through advanced analysis, and even brought in profilers to build a psychological picture of a potential abductor. Still, nothing tangible emerged. Forensic teams scoured the trail one final time, combing through brush and soil samples. But again, nothing was found. What struck many was how quickly the sense of urgency dissipated. Within weeks, the massive search teams had dwindled to a handful of officers and a rotating cast of volunteers. The helicopters were gone, the media vans left. National coverage moved on to other stories. What remained was a town suspended in grief, frozen by the mystery in its midst. For Sarah's friends, the loss was unbearable. Some visited her house regularly, leaving notes and flowers by her window. Others avoided the Whitmores altogether, unable to face the rawness of their pain. Her absence was felt in small, quiet ways. A missing voice in the daycare where she worked, an empty seat in the coffee shop she loved, silence in group chats that once buzzed with her energy. By the end of the third week, there was no progress to speak of. Detectives briefed the Whitmores with carefully chosen words, stressing that the case was still open and that they were still following up leads. But the family could see the truth in their eyes. Momentum was gone. They were no closer to finding Sarah than they had been the day she disappeared. And so the community settled into a grim routine. People still glanced at the trail as they drove past, but fewer stopped. The memorial plaque was polished, and fresh flowers were laid beneath it, but the path beyond grew empty, overgrown in patches, as though the town itself had recoiled from it. The silence of Ridgewood Trail mirrored the silence of the case. No more screams, no new sightings, just an unshakable absence that weighed heavier with each passing day. And beneath that silence, questions lingered. Was the killer still living among them? Was Sarah's body hidden close by, just beyond the reach of searchers? Or had she been taken far from Ridgewood, her fate sealed long before anyone knew she was gone? The trail had a new name, but no answers. And with every passing day, the plaque at its entrance felt less like a memorial and more like a warning. By the end of the first month, the investigation into Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had slowed to a crawl. With nobody, no confirmed witnesses, and no physical evidence, the case seemed to hang in the air, suspended in a fog of unanswered questions. But while official leads dried up, the void was quickly filled by speculation. Theories began to sprout like weeds, not just among neighbors whispering in grocery store aisles, but across the internet, where Sarah's case had become the subject of intense discussion. Entire forums were dedicated to analyzing her last known moments, dissecting every scrap of information released by law enforcement and weaving them into competing narratives. The first theory to gain traction was the most painful for her family to hear, that Sarah had planned her own disappearance. Online sleuths dug through her social media, searching for hints of dissatisfaction, cryptic posts, or coded goodbyes. They pointed out that she was 22, an age when many young adults feel trapped between dependence and independence, a time when some disappear to start over. A few seized on the fact that she had once shared an article about moving abroad, interpreting it as evidence she had dreamed of escaping her life. Others noted that her bank account was untouched, and her phone went dead almost immediately, arguing that she may have ditched her digital footprint on purpose. But friends and family rejected that theory outright. Sarah was close with her parents, excited about her future, and deeply committed to the children at the daycare where she worked. There were no signs she was unhappy. Detectives also found no evidence of financial planning, no hidden purchases, and no secret correspondence that might point to her plotting an escape. The theory lingered online, but to investigators, it seemed unlikely. The second theory cut in a different direction, one that chilled the community. Some believed Sarah was the victim of a predator, possibly a serial offender operating in the region. Amateur sleuths began connecting her case to other missing persons reports from neighboring counties. They noted similarities: young women vanishing during routine activities and broad daylight disappearances that left almost no trace. It was speculation, but it gained traction quickly. Detectives did look closely at known offenders in the area. They ran checks on every registered sex offender within 50 miles of Ridgewood Trail, reviewing alibis and movements on the morning Sarah vanished. Several were questioned extensively. None matched the timeline, and none had evidence linking them to Sarah. Still, the possibility of a serial predator wasn't dismissed. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts who suggested the abduction, if that's what it was, had likely been premeditated. Someone may have studied her habits, learned her route, and chosen that morning to strike. It was a chilling possibility that made the community more uneasy. One piece of evidence kept investigators circling back: the white pickup truck. Footage from a traffic camera had captured it circling the area near Ridgewood Trail twice that morning. The movements were unusual. The truck slowed near the entrance, drove off, then returned minutes later, again lingering before disappearing from view. Detectives worked to identify the vehicle, combing through DMV records, pulling data on every white pickup registered in the area. They checked commercial vehicles, landscapers, and construction crews. But without a license plate or distinguishing features, the search was nearly impossible. Days turned into weeks, and the truck remained a ghost on grainy footage, unidentified, unclaimed, and unexplained. Theories about the truck flourished online. Some insisted it belonged to a kidnapper who had been scouting Sarah specifically. Others argued it could have been innocent, a contractor lost in the area, or a driver waiting to meet someone. Without answers, it became a symbol of frustration, the kind of tantalizing lead that seemed so close to a breakthrough, yet dissolved into nothing. As speculation mounted, detectives were forced to spend more time addressing rumors than developing new leads. Tips poured in from across the state, sightings of Sarah at gas stations, and claims she had been seen in shopping malls or diners. Each was investigated. Each ended the same way: mistaken identity. Investigators even traveled hours away to check on a report from a woman convinced she had served Sarah at a roadside restaurant. It wasn't her. The noise of false leads began to drown out the investigation. Online sleuths accused police of incompetence, claiming they ignored key evidence or failed to act quickly enough. Detectives pushed back, but the reality was simple. The case had no movement. Even the FBI, with all its resources, could not force answers from silence. For the Whitmore family, the swirl of theories was both agonizing and inescapable. Margaret refused to look at the online forums, but Daniel couldn't help himself. Late at night, he scrolled through endless threads, reading strangers debating his daughter's fate, some insisting she was dead, others spinning elaborate stories about secret lives and hidden motives. The speculation brought no comfort. It only deepened the ache of not knowing. 3 months after Sarah vanished, detectives gathered for a case review. They pinned maps, laid out evidence, and replayed interviews. Everything circled back to the same points. Sarah left for a run. She was never seen again. Her phone went dead almost immediately, and the only anomaly was a white pickup that could never be traced. Beyond that, the file was empty. Eventually, even the public's attention began to drift. New stories dominated headlines. Other cases demanded attention. The crowd of volunteers dwindled. The vigils stopped. Flyers faded and tore in the rain. For the Whitmores, life remained frozen. But for everyone else, the world moved on. The silence that followed was perhaps the cruelest part of all. A young woman had vanished in broad daylight, and despite helicopters, dogs, the FBI, and thousands of man-hours, no one could explain how. Theories had been raised, suspects considered, and clues examined. But none of it held weight. The investigation hit a dead end. And as weeks turned into months, Sarah's case began to take on a different identity, not as an active search, but as a haunting mystery, a cold file, a name in a drawer. And yet, somewhere out there, the truth still existed. Whether buried, hidden, or locked inside someone's memory, it was waiting. The question was whether it would ever be found. In October of 2025, nearly a decade after Sarah Whitmore vanished on her morning run, her name had all but disappeared from daily conversation. Her case lived quietly in the background, known mostly to her family, a handful of cold case detectives, and scattered online communities that refused to let it die. But on a damp autumn morning in a forgotten farmhouse on Larkspur Lane, everything changed. The house had stood abandoned for years, a crumbling shell on the edge of farmland just 14 miles from Ridgewood Trail. Locals called it cursed. Teenagers dared each other to break in at night, and neighbors whispered that it carried bad history. In reality, it was just neglected. Windows boarded, roof sagging, weeds clawing at its walls. By 2025, it was scheduled for demolition. Contractors arrived with orders to strip it before the machinery came in. None of them expected to find anything unusual. While clearing debris from the attic, one of the workers noticed something odd, a section of wall that didn't quite match. The boards were newer, sealed tightly with nails that didn't show the same weathering as the rest of the attic. At first, they thought it was structural reinforcement, but curiosity pulled them closer. With crowbars and hammers, they pried at the boards until the wood splintered away. Behind it was a crawl space, narrow, suffocating, and sealed like a tomb. The air that seeped out was stale, thick with dust and mildew. Inside, their flashlights caught on a few objects that stopped them cold. A faded runner's bib, torn and yellowed with age, folded neatly against the wall. A roll of duct tape, half used, beside strands of hair stuck to the boards. And in the corner, an old iPhone, its case cracked, its surface caked in grime. The men froze, suddenly aware that what they had uncovered was no ordinary storage. Within minutes, they called authorities. By the time the first squad cars arrived, the house had become a crime scene. Investigators swarmed Larkspur Lane that afternoon. Crime scene tape went up, the property was locked down, and forensic vans were parked in the overgrown driveway. For detectives, it was the kind of discovery that sends a jolt through even the most seasoned officers. They photographed every inch of the crawl space, cataloging the objects as if they were relics from a time capsule of horror. The runner's bib was the first to raise the alarm. It bore a number, faded, but still legible. Cross-referencing old race records, detectives quickly matched it to Sarah Whitmore, who had run a charity event in the spring of 2015, a year before her disappearance. It wasn't proof, but it was a direct link, a personal belonging, now discovered in a place she had no reason to ever be. The duct tape and hair were collected with gloved hands and sealed into evidence bags for analysis. Forensics would later confirm that the hair strands were human, though DNA results would take weeks. But the item that drew the most attention was the iPhone. When bagged and examined, it was found to be an older model, consistent with what Sarah was known to have owned in 2016. Though the battery was long dead, technicians believed data could still be extracted. The implications were staggering. If the phone had belonged to Sarah, then the crawl space wasn't just storage. It was a place tied directly to her disappearance. Detective Michael Carver, who had quietly worked Sarah's cold case for years, was among the first on the scene. He stood in the attic, staring at the crawl space, his notepad forgotten in his pocket. For years he had pored over empty leads, chasing ghosts. Now, standing inside a decaying farmhouse miles from Ridgewood, he felt both exhilaration and dread. The discovery was a breakthrough, yes, but it also suggested something darker, that Sarah had been here, hidden away in silence, in a place no one thought to look. News spread quickly. By evening, local stations were broadcasting live from Larkspur Lane, their anchors struggling to contain the shock in their voices. The community, long resigned to silence, was suddenly jolted awake. Sarah's name trended again. People who had moved on, who had convinced themselves the case would never be solved, now debated whether this was the beginning of long-awaited answers or the start of an even more terrifying mystery. The farmhouse was sealed off for days. Forensic teams worked meticulously, scouring not just the attic but the entire property. They searched the basement, the surrounding fields, and even shallow ground near the foundation. Every creak of wood, every fragment of dust was documented. Neighbors were re-interviewed and asked if they had noticed anything strange over the years. Lights in the windows, cars parked out front, signs that the supposedly abandoned property hadn't been as empty as it seemed. Most had nothing to offer. Some admitted they rarely looked at the place at all. For Sarah's family, the discovery reopened wounds they had never truly closed. Margaret, upon hearing about the items found in the attic, collapsed into tears. Daniel clenched his fists in anger, demanding answers. For them, the objects weren't abstract evidence. They were tangible reminders of their daughter, proof that she had been taken somewhere, that she had been close all along. But they also raised unrelenting questions. Had she been alive in that crawl space? Had she suffered there? And most haunting of all, why was nothing found until now, 9 years later? Detectives tried to temper expectations. The items were significant, yes, but they were not conclusive. There was no body, no direct evidence of Sarah's fate. Still, the discovery shifted the investigation from cold to active, and with it came renewed scrutiny. The farmhouse had been owned by multiple individuals over the years. including a real estate agent who disappeared in 2018. His name, already a mystery, suddenly took on new weight. Detectives began digging into his history, wondering if he was connected not just to Sarah, but to something larger. As night fell on Larkspur Lane, the farmhouse stood in eerie silence, its attic stripped bare, its secrets slowly pried into the open. For investigators, the crawlspace was no longer just a curiosity. It was a crime scene, a place where the line between past and present blurred. And as the evidence bags filled with Sarah's belongings, one truth became clear. After 9 years of silence, the house on Larkspur Lane had begun to speak. What it had to say would change everything. When investigators bagged the iPhone from the crawlspace of the farmhouse, most expected it to be too degraded to matter. 9 years in an attic sealed from the world, exposed to heat, cold, and dust, it seemed impossible that anything of value would remain. But forensic technicians are trained never to dismiss an item until it has been fully examined. The phone was taken to the digital forensics lab, cataloged, and connected to specialized equipment. When the serial number came back, the first ripple of shock went through the team. It was confirmed. The phone had once belonged to Sarah Whitmore. In 2016, her phone had been one of the first mysteries of the case. It had gone silent within minutes of her disappearance. She was never traced, never recovered. Detectives had assumed it had been destroyed, tossed into water, or dismantled to erase evidence. Yet here it was, preserved in an attic not far from where she was last seen alive. The battery was swollen and dead, but the internal storage was remarkably intact. Specialists worked around the clock, carefully extracting data sector by sector. What they found turned the cold case into something far darker. Among the recovered files were 17 voice memos, all dated in the days following Sarah's disappearance. The timestamps placed them between April 12th and April 17th of 2016, 5 days after she went missing. That detail alone changed the nature of the investigation. It suggested that Sarah had not been killed immediately. She had been alive, hidden somewhere, with enough presence of mind to record messages. The first memos were brief, almost frantic. In a trembling voice, Sarah whispered her name and the date and begged whoever might find the phone to tell her parents she loved them. In later recordings, her words became more fragmented. She described being locked in a small room, hearing footsteps above her, and at one point, the sound of hammering as though something was being built or sealed. Investigators speculated she may have been describing the very crawl space where the phone was found. But one recording stood apart from the rest. In it, her voice was almost inaudible, a hoarse whisper pressed against the microphone. After a pause, 2 words emerged. "He's coming." The memo ended abruptly. For agents listening in the forensic lab, the silence that followed was suffocating. The implication was chilling. Sarah hadn't just vanished. She had been held captive, aware of someone watching, someone returning. The memos were immediately classified as evidence. The FBI were brought in to assist, their analysts poring over every detail. Background noises were enhanced and studied. One recording contained the faint creak of floorboards, consistent with movement in the house above her. Another carried the muffled hum of a vehicle engine, possibly a truck idling nearby. Yet no clear voice of another person was ever captured, only Sarah's desperate whispers. Publicly, law enforcement released little. Officials confirmed the phone belonged to Sarah, but only fragments of the memos were acknowledged. They admitted that recordings existed, but refused to play them in full, citing the sensitivity of the case and the trauma it would cause her family. Still, word spread. Reporters learned enough to describe haunting audio messages from Sarah, and the story exploded across news cycles. For a public that had nearly forgotten her name, the revelation was electrifying. For the Whitmores, the news was devastating. For years they had lived with uncertainty, tortured by the possibility that Sarah had suffered. Now the memos confirmed it. She hadn't been taken and killed quickly. She had been alive, imprisoned, terrified, her voice preserved like an echo from a grave. Margaret could not bring herself to listen to the audio. Daniel did, and afterward he wept harder than he ever had before, saying he wished he hadn't. Knowing his daughter had been so close, so frightened, yet utterly beyond their reach, was a pain sharper than silence. Detective Carver, who had pursued Sarah's case with relentless patience, saw the memos as both a breakthrough and a curse. They were proof that Sarah had been alive days after the world stopped searching for her. Proof that someone had held her, hidden her, and kept her prisoner. But they offered no name, no clear clue, no direction. It was like holding pieces of a puzzle without the image to complete it. The discovery of the phone forced investigators to revisit the farmhouse in greater detail. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan beneath the floors. Forensic teams peeled away layers of wood and soil, searching for human remains. Nothing was found. The house yielded objects and whispers of her presence, but not Sarah herself. Online communities erupted once more, dissecting every scrap of information. Some argued the memos proved the work of a methodical predator, someone who built hidden spaces to keep victims alive. Others suggested Sarah's captor may have been someone in the community, someone who used the farmhouse as a temporary site before moving her elsewhere. Theories multiplied, but without more evidence, they were only speculation. Inside the FBI, debates raged over whether to release more of the recordings to the public in the hope of generating leads. But concerns about contaminating witness testimony, or worse, exploiting Sarah's suffering for headlines, won out. Only vague descriptions of the audio were provided, leaving most of the content locked away in classified files. For Carver, the most haunting detail wasn't what Sarah said. It was the silence between her words. Long stretches where she seemed to be listening, waiting, fearful of being caught. It suggested she recorded the memos in stolen moments, aware that discovery could bring consequences. Each whisper was not just a message, but a gamble for survival. By the time the FBI finished its preliminary analysis, the conclusion was unavoidable. Sarah Whitmore had not simply vanished. She had been abducted, held alive for at least 5 days, and silenced only when her captor decided her time was up. The farmhouse on Larkspur Lane had preserved the proof, but not the ending. And as detectives filed away the phone into evidence, one truth settled over them like a shadow. If Sarah's voice was captured here, then somewhere, there had to be more. Other rooms, other victims, other voices waiting to be found. After the discovery of Sarah's phone, investigators knew they had only begun to scratch the surface of what the farmhouse on Larkspur Lane was hiding. Forensics teams widened their search, probing not only the attic but the structure as a whole. The house, long condemned and left to rot, had an unsettling presence even in daylight. The boards groaned under every step, and dust clung to the air like a veil. But what mattered now wasn't its outward decay. It was what might lie within its walls. Detectives authorized ground-penetrating radar scans, the kind used in forensic archaeology. The device swept across the attic floor, then down into the rooms below. At first, the images came back as static and noise. But then, beneath a section of the ground-level floorboards, an anomaly appeared. A cavity. Roughly 6 feet by 8, investigators marked the area and carefully began prying up the planks. What they revealed was not a simple hollow space. It was a hidden room. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to fit through. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. When the first officer lowered himself into the space, his flashlight beam cut across walls that had been lined with soundproofing. Layers of cheap insulation, carpet remnants, and even egg cartons nailed in rows. It was crude but effective, designed to keep noise in. The floor was dirt, damp and uneven, and from its center stretched a length of chain bolted into the foundation. The deeper the flashlight swept, the more disturbing details came into focus. Along the wall, scratch marks crisscrossed the surface, some faint, others gouged deep into the wood. They weren't random. They were desperate, frantic attempts at escape. Investigators counted dozens, then stopped counting. The air inside the room was stale, tinged with mildew and something metallic. It was, unmistakably, a cell. Evidence technicians worked in silence as they photographed every inch, bagging objects left behind. A thin, mold-stained blanket lay crumpled in a corner. Rusted food tins were scattered near the ladder, and embedded in the walls, strands of hair clung to splinters, caught in the grooves of the scratches. Samples were taken immediately. Days later, the results would confirm what investigators already suspected. The DNA matched Sarah Whitmore. She had been there. For Detective Carver, the confirmation was both a victory and a nightmare. It proved Sarah hadn't just been abducted, she had been imprisoned. She had spent her final days, maybe longer, locked beneath the farmhouse, chained like an animal, scratching at the walls until her strength gave out. The voice memos from her phone suddenly carried a new, sharper weight. When she whispered, "He's coming," she wasn't speaking figuratively. She was describing life inside a cell, listening to footsteps above, waiting for the sound of the latch. And yet, the room carried no remains. Nobody, no trace of her final moments. For all the horror it revealed, the hidden cell also deepened the mystery. Sarah had been there, yes, but where had she gone? Was she moved alive to another location, or had her body been disposed of elsewhere, leaving only her presence etched into the scratches of the walls? Attention quickly turned to the farmhouse's ownership. Records showed it had passed through several hands over the years, but one name in particular stood out. From 2012 to 2018, the property belonged to a local real estate agent named Thomas Keller. Keller was known in the community, outgoing, professional, with no criminal history. But in 2018, 2 years after Sarah's disappearance, Keller himself vanished. He was reported missing by colleagues after failing to show up for appointments. His car was found abandoned in a neighboring county. He was never located. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Detectives dug into Keller's background, pulling financial records, interviewing surviving relatives, and combing through his professional dealings. Nothing suggested he had been under threat. Nothing hinted at why he would vanish. But in the shadows of the farmhouse, suspicion hardened. Was Keller Sarah's abductor? Did he build the crawl space, the soundproofed room, the prison beneath the floorboards? And if so, what had happened to him? Neighbors were re-interviewed, this time with Keller's name on the table. Some recalled he had visited the property less frequently than expected, often late at night, his truck parked discreetly. Others admitted they rarely paid attention. To them, it was just another farmhouse, another patch of land among many. No one had suspected what was inside. For the Whitmores, the revelation was shattering. To know their daughter had been held so close for so long, hidden in a cell beneath ordinary floorboards, was unbearable. Margaret refused to step foot on the property. Daniel, however, insisted on seeing it for himself. Guided by detectives, he descended into the narrow space. When he saw the scratches, the chain, and the strands of hair, he broke down, saying only that he could feel her presence there. It was a place of suffering, but also the last place she had lived. Investigators expanded the search beyond the house, digging shallow trenches around the property, scanning nearby woods and checking wells and drainage pipes. They found nothing. No clothing. No remains. The cell gave them certainty of what Sarah endured, but not closure. In some ways, it made the absence of her body even more haunting. Detective Carver pressed forward with Keller as the prime suspect, though he acknowledged the gap in the timeline. If Keller had indeed taken Sarah, why had he himself disappeared 2 years later? Has someone else been involved? Was Keller also a victim of the same darkness he had inflicted on others? Or had he fled, leaving behind the house and its secrets to vanish into a different life? The farmhouse on Larkspur Lane had transformed from a forgotten ruin into the centerpiece of a nightmare. It held proof of captivity, proof of Sarah's final days, yet withheld the answer her family needed most. No one knew where she had gone when the scratching stopped. No one knew who had turned the key in the lock for the last time. And as detectives closed the property down and sealed the evidence, the unanswered questions hung heavier than ever. The scratches in the wood had spoken. The DNA had confirmed her presence, but the silence of the room beneath the floorboards was louder still. Because if Sarah had been here, then the mystery was no longer whether she had been taken. The mystery was what came next, and who else the hidden room might have once held. After the hidden cell beneath the floorboards was uncovered, the farmhouse on Larkspur Lane was no longer just a crime scene. It was evidence of something larger, something that had existed quietly beneath the surface for years. Sarah Whitmore had not simply been abducted. She had been confined, hidden, and erased from view. But as the forensic dust settled and the initial shock gave way to analysis, one question began to take shape among investigators. What if she wasn't the only one? Detective Michael Carver wasn't ready to call it a serial case, not yet. But as he sat in the precinct late into the night, files spread across his desk. He couldn't ignore the pattern forming in front of him. He pulled up the missing persons database and began narrowing the radius. 50 miles from Ridgewood. Women. Disappearances that had never been resolved. And slowly, painfully, a picture started to form. The first case dated back to 2010. Amanda Kellis, 25, disappeared while on an early morning bike ride near Tannersville. Her bike was later found resting against a tree at the edge of a forest trail. No struggle, no signs of distress. At the time, police believed she may have wandered into the woods and become lost. Searches turned up nothing. The case went cold. Next was Jasmine Ortega, 30, a long-distance runner from Lehigh Valley. In 2012, she vanished during a training session on a trail network just outside Allentown. Friends said she was preparing for a half marathon. Her smartwatch was later discovered in a storm drain 5 miles from her last known location. Police suspected foul play, but never identified a suspect. 2 years later, in 2014, Chelsea Huang, 27, disappeared after leaving her apartment in Redding for a jog along the Schuylkill River Trail. Security footage captured her jogging alone near a bridge just before sunrise. She was never seen again. Her case was quietly archived after exhaustive search efforts failed. And then, Sarah Whitmore in 2016. 4 women. All within the same 50-mile radius, all in peak physical health, all disappearing during solo exercise routines. Carver laid the files side by side. The similarities were too sharp to be coincidence, and yet none of these cases had ever been formally linked. Different jurisdictions, different lead investigators, different media cycles. Now, with the discovery of Sarah's presence in a makeshift cell, Carver saw them with new eyes. The Larkspur farmhouse had all the hallmarks of a planned location, a structure modified for imprisonment, sealed and soundproofed. It was functional, intentional. Which begged the question, if Sarah had been held there, had the others been brought through as well? Or were there other houses, other farms, other hidden spaces? He took his theory to the task force. At first, there was hesitation. Reopening cold cases meant resources, time, and scrutiny. But the logic was hard to argue. Each case fits a disturbing template. Young women, fit, moving alone through isolated areas, no known enemies, no known motives. The randomness of their disappearances, once dismissed as tragic coincidence, now looked methodical. The media caught wind quickly. Stories with titles like, "Is There a Pattern?" and "Four Gone Missing, the Forgotten Cases" began circulating. The public, already rattled by the revelations from Larkspur Lane, responded with renewed urgency. News stations replayed footage of the missing women, interviews with their families, and clips from years-old press conferences. Each story, once its own isolated tragedy, now folded into a collective nightmare. FBI analysts were brought in to construct a timeline. They examined gaps between disappearances, regional maps, and behavioral patterns. One finding stood out. Each disappearance occurred approximately 2 years apart during spring or early summer, always within a 10-mile radius of remote hiking or running trails. If the farmhouse was a holding site, as the analysts now called it, then it was unlikely to have been the only one. Carver and his team began cross-referencing property records, looking for other abandoned or foreclosed homes owned by Thomas Keller, the missing real estate agent whose name was now synonymous with suspicion. They found 3. One, in particular, drew their attention: a foreclosed home outside Hamburg, Pennsylvania, purchased by Keller in 2009 and sold suddenly in late 2011. The current owner had let the property fall into disrepair. A warrant was issued. Investigators searched the premises, focusing on basements, crawl spaces, and anything that might mirror what was found at Larkspur. They uncovered a small concrete room beneath the foundation. Unlike Larkspur, it had been stripped bare. No furnishings, no insulation, no personal items. But traces of old chains were found embedded in the floor. Soil samples were taken. A cadaver dog alerted near the edge of the room, but no remains were recovered. Forensics were inconclusive. Still, for Carver, it was enough to confirm a theory he had only whispered to himself in the quiet moments between interviews. This wasn't one isolated event. It was a pattern. The case file grew exponentially. New jurisdictions joined the task force. Retired officers from the older disappearances were interviewed again. Some had suspected connections at the time but lacked support to pursue them. Now, those suspicions were given new life. Families of the other victims were contacted. Some expressed cautious hope. Others had long accepted that their loved ones were gone. But hearing that their daughters, sisters, and friends were potentially tied to something larger gave them something they hadn't had in years: a sense that their stories might still matter. As investigators looked further into Keller's history, inconsistencies began to emerge. Business transactions that made no sense, gaps in his travel history, an unlisted storage unit in New Jersey. Every thread led to another question. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed that Sarah's story wasn't just the outlier. It was the key. Her voice, her DNA, and her presence in that room had cracked open a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for over a decade. And yet, one haunting truth remained. Even with all the files and maps and theories, no bodies had ever been recovered. The trails led into darkness, but not out. The forensic team almost missed it. Tucked in the corner of Sarah Whitmore's recovered iPhone, buried among system files and hidden cache, was a final voice memo, one that hadn't been visible in the initial extraction. The data was partially corrupted. It took hours of careful reconstruction before the audio would even play without breaking apart. When it finally loaded, investigators sat in silence, headphones on, the room dark except for the glow of monitors. The timestamp was April 17th, 2016, 5 days after Sarah was reported missing. The memo begins with nearly 30 seconds of static. Then, barely audible, her voice emerges, dry, hoarse, struggling to form words. Unlike the others, which often started in panic or rushed urgency, this one is slow, exhausted. Her breathing is shallow. And then, just above the noise, she says, "If someone finds this, I think there are more like me. Please don't stop." It was the last time anyone would ever hear her voice. The weight of those words changed everything. They weren't just a goodbye. They were a warning, a message from a victim who, even in her final moments, understood she was part of something larger, something that hadn't ended with her. For Carver and the task force, it was a gut punch. It confirmed what the investigation was already starting to suggest. Sarah may have been one of several. The memo was played only once for her parents. Margaret couldn't bear to listen through to the end. Daniel did, his hands shaking the entire time. When it finished, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The farmhouse on Larkspur Lane was searched again, this time with a level of scrutiny that bordered on obsessiveness. Cadaver dogs were brought in from out of state. Walls were scanned for hidden compartments. Soil samples were taken from the yard, the crawl space, and even the chimney flue. But it was as if the house had given all it was willing to give. Nobody, no new evidence, just Sarah's belongings, her voice, her fear, now captured forever in a file that would be replayed in every investigator's mind. Public pressure mounted, but without new leads, the case began to lose oxygen again. The suspect, Thomas Keller, remained a ghost. Despite efforts to trace his whereabouts, no definitive proof emerged of where he had gone, or whether he was even alive. A few reports surfaced of sightings, but none held up. One tip claimed he had changed his name and was living off the grid in Montana. Another placed him at a remote cabin in British Columbia. All dead ends. Investigators turned to Keller's personal history. They dug through his college years, searched his family tree, and interviewed former clients and colleagues. Most described him as quiet, intelligent, and slightly detached. No one had suspected him of anything beyond a tendency to keep to himself, but he had access. He had keys. He had knowledge of vacant properties, homes no one would check for years. He had the means, and possibly the motive. Still, without a body or a confession, the case couldn't move forward. Sarah was officially classified as a presumed homicide, but no charges were filed. The Larkspur house was never torn down. After forensic investigators finished, the property was locked and condemned once more. Some believed it should be burnt to the ground. Others thought it should stand, untouched, as a reminder of what had happened inside. Online, the case sparked a renewed wave of amateur investigation. Forums flooded with posts, timelines, property records, and satellite images of nearby abandoned homes. Some self-styled sleuths claimed to have identified other potential victims. Others accused police of hiding information. But beneath the noise was the same hollow truth. The only real evidence remained the voice Sarah left behind. In 2026, nearly a year after the discovery of the crawlspace, the FBI officially expanded its investigation into possible serial abductions connected to Keller. The cases of Amanda Kellis, Jasmine Ortega, and Chelsea Huang were reclassified as under active review. But without physical evidence linking Keller to any of them, nothing could be proven. Their families were contacted, files were reopened, teams quietly searched old crime scenes with new tools. But again, nothing was found. The media eventually moved on. Other stories took the spotlight. The farmhouse faded from public view, its secrets sealed once again behind boarded windows and police tape. But the people closest to the case couldn't forget. Carver still keeps Sarah's file on his desk. Not in a cabinet, not in storage. On his desk. He says he reads her memo once a month, not because he needs to, but because it reminds him what's left undone. In interviews, he said he doesn't think Sarah was the first, and he doesn't believe she was the last. The Whitmores now live in a smaller home, far from Ridgewood. They don't give interviews. They've chosen to grieve in private. A small plaque with Sarah's name sits in their garden. Not a gravestone. There's still nobody to bury. And the trail where she vanished, once renamed Whitmore Loop, remains quiet. Joggers return occasionally, but fewer than before. Some say they still feel something when they pass the trailhead. A heaviness, a pause, a reminder that sometimes people disappear without a trace, and sometimes, if they're lucky, they leave behind a voice. That's all Sarah left. A phone buried in an attic. A whisper recorded in the dark. A single sentence that echoed louder than any evidence they found. If someone finds this, I think there are more like me. Please don't stop. And for the investigators who still work her case, for the families still waiting for answers, and for the empty trails that wind quietly through wooded towns across the state, those words remain.